The problem with work is the workday is poorly designed.
I think you made a mistake on my schedule because it says I'm supposed to be working tomorrow, which is perfectly fine. I don't mind working tomorrow, but it says I'm supposed to be coming in at 5 a.m. I mean, it's already 11:30. So by the time I get home, it's going to be 12 o'clock. God forbid I eat dinner, right? Or take a shower. Who knows what time it'll be? It might be 1:30. Then I'm only getting, 3-4 hours of sleep? I mean, I might as well sleep right here.
That was TikTok user Maxsauce talking about clopening, closing a shift only to come back a few hours later to open another shift. Just one example of how poorly designed the workday can be. This is Fast Company's The New Way We Work, where we take listeners on a journey through the changing landscape of our work lives and explain exactly what we need to build the future we want. I'm Fast Company Deputy Editor Kathleen Davis. The theme of this season is the problem with work, and the biggest problem with work for many of us isn't anything to do with our jobs themselves. It's how they constantly conflict with everything else in life. We take for granted the standard 40-hour, 5-day work week, but the truth is the structure was created less than 100 years ago to suit a much different type of work in a very different reality than most of us live in today. In recent years, the 4-day work week has gained attention, but that kind of restructuring leaves many with more logistical questions than answers, and it fails to solve some of the most fundamental problems with how many people's workdays are structured. What about parents trying to match a school schedule, or sleep-deprived medical workers, or service workers who don't know their hours in advance? A 3-day weekend sounds nice, but it falls woefully short in solving some of these fundamental issues with how the workday and work week are structured. So how can we redesign the workday to fit both employee and business needs? Is there a way to make the workday and work week more humane that can work across industries? And is widespread change even possible? To help me parse through how to rethink our workdays is California Congressman Mark Takano. Representative Takano introduced a 32-hour work week bill in Congress in 2021. He's also working on restoring the Overtime Act to increase the threshold for full-time salary workers nationally. So let's start with the problem. As you've highlighted in your bill, on average, U.S. workers work 200 hours more per year than workers in other developed countries, and the U.S. have seen significant increases in worker productivity, but stagnant wages. Why are we working so much?
Well, my own guess as to why Americans work so much is the cost of everything, the cost of housing, the cost of food, of amenities, clothing, everything together means that Americans have to work long hours. There was a time when people could get by on a one-income household. What became normalized was a two-income household. That wasn't all bad in terms of encouraging a fully participatory workforce. But I think the sheer cost of living means that people have to work a lot of hours. And would they choose to do that if they didn't have to? And I think the answer is that probably not. That for most Americans, they would want to spend more time with their kids. They would want to be able to have the freedom to take care of elders and also be involved in their communities. This is all about the work-life balance. Now, people do get satisfaction and connection to others by working as well. I mean, depending on what enterprise that you're engaged with, whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, there's usually some sort of mission associated with it. You have, whether it's producing shoes or clothing or a service, or you're selling automobiles, you're making some sort of contribution to the whole. And that connects you to everybody else in the community, but you're also connected to a community at work. And so, work provides that sort of human connection. But definitely there's a quality to work that's different than having your own leisure and having your own choice what to do with your time. Work obligates you and obligates your time. You're meeting the necessities of life by working. What I notice is that in other advanced economies, other liberal economies, liberal democratic economies, Americans do work hard by comparison, and harder and longer hours in comparison to the workers in other countries. We have less vacation time, less protections regarding paid leave. And I think the pandemic of 2020, where great swaths of the American workforce had to stay home, that many Americans were discovering really how hard they were working, especially in, say, the service industry, especially servers and restaurants and bartenders who are on their feet a lot. They really discovered just how many hours they were working and how hard they were working. And then we had what was known as the Great Resignation. People deciding that they weren't going to go back to their jobs, that somehow this experience of more than 1 million Americans dying through the COVID infection, the impact of that collectively on the American nation, I don't think is fully understood or fully appreciated. One thing that I think one understanding that I took from it is that people understood that time was also important. And so my feeling is we came out of the pandemic with a kind of an idea that let's not go back to the old normal, the way it was. Let's look at a new normal, at least a new attitude.
Yeah, I think there's so much. I mean, you're so right. There's so much about, the name of this podcast is The New Way We Work. There's so much about the way that we've worked that we just kind of take for granted as the way that it's supposed to be. It's always been. And you're right, 2020 is a big change, and like maybe it doesn't have to be this way. And yeah, the 40-hour work week is something we very much kind of take for granted as this standard. It's certainly not set in stone. It has not always been like this. Our current standard of the 40-hour work week was actually, as you know, born from the 1938 provision in the Fair Labor Standards Act. And your bill looks to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act again. What's included in your bill?
My bill would amend the Fair Labor Standards Act of the 1930s. So we're nearly almost 100 years, or 90 years. If 1938, we're like 2024 this year. So we're just a few years away from the 100th anniversary or the centennial of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So the Fair Labor Standards Act set minimum wage, the federal government's ability to regulate minimum wage across the country. It set standards for overtime, and specifically my bill and the work week. And so the way it does it says, well, if you work more than 40 hours a week, you're entitled to 1.5 times overtime pay. And my bill simply says, we're going to change that to 32 hours. So instead of earning overtime pay at 40 hours, you start earning overtime pay at 32 hours. My bill doesn't stipulate that you can only work a 30-hour work week. If you want to work longer, or your employer wants to work you long, or wants you to work longer, they can ask you to do that. But if they do, they got to pay you time and a half after 32 hours instead of 40. Now, my counterpart in the Senate, Senator Sanders, introduced a 32-hour work week bill, but he mandated in his bill that you get the same pay as you would have during a 40-hour work week for a 32-hour work week. I'm contemplating matching that language, but possibly making exceptions for smaller businesses. And what that cutoff would be, we're still kind of talking through that. But I think, our intent is pretty much the same, that we're looking to see how the efficiencies and productivity gains that occur because of technological advancements, that those gains don't just go to capital or people who own things, that workers also need to share in those benefits, right? And so you alluded to that in your opening statement, that we've had tremendous gains in productivity even before AI, artificial intelligence. We've seen We had the information revolution and computers and the internet. All these technological advancements have allowed workers to do way more than, one worker to do way more than, say, a typical worker did like 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. But even as they've gotten way more done and been far more productive, workers as a whole, they've not seen their salaries or wages increase to the extent that we've seen the profits of companies and individuals go up.
Yes, that's such an important point, and that's something that's brought up a lot when we talk about shortening the work week. Is, of course, I'm sure as you know, John Maynard Keynes many years ago predicted that the advance of technology would mean that we'd be working 15-hour work weeks by now. Obviously, we're not. Obviously, as you say, those profits have gone to the companies while we are still working kind of the longer hours. What's the current status of the bill? You first introduced it in 2022, correct?
I think I've introduced it. I've obviously introduced this Congress. I know I've introduced it in the prior Congress. I know that we were introducing it as we were coming out of the pandemic. So I think I did it in 2021. So 2021 was the first year I did it. How I can kind of backtrack and kind of figure that out is that we were looking to do it earlier. We had drafted the bill much earlier, but we were a little kind of skittish about doing it too early in the pandemic, because the economics, if you kind of bring yourself back into the mindset of what living through that pandemic was really like. I mean, a lot of people were like out of work, and they were receiving some sort of help, through different federal aid bills, through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, and we thought that the moment wasn't right early on, but as we started to come out of it and people were going back to work, I remember we dropped the bill in the spring, and it got a lot of attention. It got a lot of attention, a lot of interest from ordinary people who just were, I think, very, very much kind of captivated by it. So the status of the bill now is it's not going to get any attention in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives. Senator Sanders held a hearing on his bill, and had experts testify about it. That's a big change, an advancement of it. I can tell you that there's been polling done on it. It's interesting polling, which it didn't exist when I first introduced the legislation. That it polls remarkably well. We know that actually the poll, it does well on a bipartisan basis. So independents backed the proposal by 58% to 31%. Republican voters show an openness to a 32-hour work week, disapproving only by 44% to 49%. And there's almost those with education, or those with degrees, and those without degrees. So voters that have a college degree, 60% of voters with a college degree think we should have a shorter work week. Those without a college degree, 56%. Young people, it's off the charts, 68%. That's surprising. If you're older than 45 years old, 51%. So still a majority of Americans who are over that age of 45 believe it. So yes, young people tend to like it a lot more, but it's popular across the board.
I will say none of those numbers surprised me. I would actually think that they would be higher, because it really is an issue that, as I say about, the topics that we talk about on the show, it's an issue that affects anybody with a job. It's not just, a certain industry or a certain type of job or a certain demographic or a certain part of the country. It's, the 40-hour work week is our standard. I think everybody can feel how that encroaches on their normal lives. As you say, got a taste of a different way to do things, kind of realized a different reality. But yeah, so I'm actually not surprised. I'm surprised that it's not more popular. So your bill is called the 32-Hour Workweek Act. It's been endorsed by the 4-day work week global. A 32-hour work week and a 4-day work week aren't necessarily the same thing. Do you think that there's a standard structure that should be nationally adopted? Right now, the kind of standard structure is the 9 to 5, 5 days a week, 40-hour work week.
I'm not looking to do 4-day work week, 12 hours a day. We do 40 hours in 4 days instead of 5 days. That's not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about an actual that we create a new norm together, collectively, that we can make the collective choice to set a new norm. And, interestingly, what's going on with our workforce is not very even. So you opened up with this conversation by talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act and what my bill does, and that the original Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in the 1930s. And you know that not everybody is subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act. Plenty of workers who are professionals and who are highly paid, they're not considered wage earners. And so who is subject to the overtime pay provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act are people who are known as not exempt. You're not exempt. The exempt workers, the doctors, the lawyers, the programmers, the managers, people who are more highly paid and more highly skilled, they're called exempt. They're exempt from the law. So my bill wouldn't cover them. But interesting enough, my sense is that the desire and the awareness is highest among this class of people, among the more highly educated, more skilled set. And in fact, there are already sort of new norms that are creeping in. Okay, I'll give you an example. One of my friends who's a lawyer in Los Angeles has a Beverly Hills office on the west side of LA. And he says anecdotally, he always has trouble parking Monday through Thursday. Can't find a parking spot. Less of a problem on Friday. What does that anecdote tell us? That de facto, a lot of people are not working as much on Friday. And we all know that, Fridays is a much tougher day to reach people. I kind of think about that. Like how am I if I'm going to schedule a meeting, is a Friday sort of the best option, right? But what my 40-hour work week bill does do, or my 32-hour work week bill does, is it opens up the conversation and focuses concern on how do we begin to make this work for everybody else. I mean, just add to that, what kind of brought more attention to the idea of a 32-hour work week was the heightened attention paid to artificial intelligence. As people began to talk about how it would transform work and how it would impact work, that, it would affect certain kinds of positions. And actually, President Obama, during his democracy summit that he does every fall, this last one he did last October or September, he said, AI is going to make tremendous changes in our workforce and the way we work. We better start talking about ideas like UBI and a shorter work week now, right? So it's something that we have to put on the table.
It's an interesting distinction that you made, that sometimes we call them knowledge workers, the white collar jobs, the salaried employees are the ones that are kind of the industries that are talking about the 4-day work week, or sometimes the 32-hour work week, but where that's being talked about the most. But those are, as you said, not actually the employees that would benefit from the actual letter of the law about it. Are there, I think when a lot of people hear a 4-day work week, they think it's not feasible, it doesn't work, and maybe a 32-hour work week is a different frame of thought. Are there limits or challenges to switching to a 32-hour work week as a standard? Are there businesses where a 4-day work week, as you mentioned, when you said that, there's everybody, you can find parking on a Friday. There's some businesses where it's, you can kind of shut down on a Friday and it doesn't impact your business as much. Are there industries and types of businesses where that wouldn't work?
Well, what I've noticed is that you might have read about several pilots. There have been studies where you have like 50 companies or 100 companies that agreed to experiment with a shorter work week. They did it on a similar kind of basis, and so they could there's kind of a measurable experiment. I know of like 2 or 3 of these sort of experiments. In fact, when we released our bill in 2021, there was a study.
Yeah, there was a large pilot program in the UK in recent years where it was like 70 companies and like 3,000 workers. Yeah.
If you look at the kinds of companies they tend to be financial services, They tend to be, like you said, more in the services, knowledge workers. We have a greater challenge when we get to things like making cars and making widgets, actual manufacturing. Although, interestingly enough, the United Auto Workers made a 32-hour work week part of their demands. And it was in collective bargaining to try to negotiate that, right? And there again, it's technology which is sort of driving a lot of the unions to organize and to look out for their members, their working their conditions and wages. And I think the challenge is that I don't think that getting to 32-hour work week, say in a manufacturing context like automobile production, can't just be a national effort. It has to be kind of something that includes movements in, say, Japan and Germany and other major auto manufacturing nations. They have to kind of in concert set this norm. Because how can, three US automakers sort of make all this work when they've got to compete with other, major automakers that are based in Germany or Japan? But, I just saw a report just two days ago about Japanese municipalities. There's like a handful of them experimenting with a shorter work week. The idea of a shorter work week is also catching hold in other advanced economies. So when you talk about the limits, I'm saying that the limits will kind of, I think, vary according to different workforce sectors. Typically, what these experiments do is they kind of look at, can we achieve the same level of productivity in 4 days that we used to do in 5 days? And what they've typically found out is that workers became more focused, that they didn't spend as much time at the water cooler goofing off, that they kind of got more efficient about the way they used their time, and they produced, results that they were able to reduce their work hours but keep their productivity even. That's kind of how they would characterize these experiments.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I'm glad you brought up the United Auto Workers. You're right. They had that, as part of their bargaining agreement. It got left, unfortunately, on the cutting room floor, but it was because of automation. They said, we'll be working less hours because of automation. So we want to change what our standard is, which is what we kind of keep talking about. As we're talking about rethinking the workday and how the workday, the problems with the way that the workday is structured. I mean, a lot of the problems obviously bump into obligations, as you mentioned earlier, obligations that you have in your life, elder care, child care, just, all of the things of life. We've been talking a lot about, as we mentioned, like knowledge workers, office jobs, working, 4-day work week. There's a lot of, obviously that's only a small fraction of the types of jobs that Americans hold. Beyond that, there are a lot of problems with the way the workday is structured for workers in other industries. Doctors and nurses frequently work over 12-hour shifts. Those in transportation roles like subway and train conductors, pilots, air traffic control, similarly work really long hours. And there's been, as you know, instances of dangerous sleep deprivation in those positions. How can we address those issues with a restructuring of the work week?
It's going to mean we're going to need, in some cases, more people, but technology may be able to make it so that it's a combination of technology making things a lot more efficient, the kinds of uses of artificial intelligence, say the way that we do science, the way that clinical trials would get done, the way that you would look for kinds of disease markers, the reviewing thousands, maybe millions of charts in a medical contest, or experiments in biology, but just the way that maybe medicine could be practiced. Certain branches of medicine are going to be, I think, affected by AI, which would mean that perhaps more could be done with less time. So if we kind of looked at a combination of the impact, we don't fully understand or know this yet, but I'm speculating that technology is going to enable us to get more done with less man or person hours, and that if we increase the workforce, if we increase the number of doctors, the number of nurses, that currently we do have a shortage. We have wait times in the public and private healthcare systems that, we're going to have to commit to training a lot more people in the future. So in healthcare in particular, a lot of practitioners got really burnt out during the pandemic, having more and more a larger workforce. And say the federal government and local governments, state governments have a big role in making the kind of investments in, say, healthcare provider training. So it's going to be, I think, a combination of what kind of efficiencies we drive from technology and making a commitment to that workforce, staffing that workforce.
Yeah, there's some problems where you can, as you say, like really only solve them with more people. Yeah. And another industry, that has a lot of problems with the way the workday is structured, and you mentioned it earlier, is the service industry. And a few cities I know have laws around clopening, where employees are expected to work the closing shift at night and then the opening shift the next day. Of course, they have the same issue of lack of rest. That's a problem for these employees. But it's also the issue of inconsistent scheduling, which makes things like planning childcare impossible. How can we address that part of the workday structure problem?
That we can do with workforce protection laws, with worker protection laws. That kind of scheduling issue you mentioned, that could be addressed. And we do that for pilots. I mean, some people have experienced or crews, even not just pilots, but airline crews. Similar to the way we regulate also drivers for trucks. If you're not properly rested as a pilot, the airline can't allow the plane to take off. And I've sat in planes where we're not taking off because the crew is there, but they haven't been rested the number of hours they have. So that's a matter of federal regulation. And what you said, I haven't heard of clopening before.
Clopening, yes, and there are actually a few cities have made laws around it. That we obviously don't have a national regulation around it, but yeah, it's exactly the same issue. Maybe it doesn't feel as pressing because it's not the safety of flying a plane, but yeah, if you're working the closing shift at a store, at a restaurant, and then you're working the opening shift the next day, you may have 6 hours between those two shifts, 4 hours between those two shifts, even 8 hours. Is that enough time to go home, get a decent rest, and come back? Obviously not. And they also, a lot of these industries have very inconsistent scheduling where you don't know what your work hours, what your work day is going to be like from one week to the next. And, how can you plan your life then?
I think the idea of addressing the term that I'm new to is clopening. That's something that I think relates to human health and even safety on the job. But really, it's about a humane work schedule and the idea that there's some control over schedule, that we need to provide workers that kind of protection as well.
The last question that I wanted to ask, and we've talked about the auto industry a couple of times. We've talked about a lot of different types of industries and businesses. In the early 1900s, Henry Ford actually introduced the idea of the 5-day work week, which was unheard of at the time. There used to be no such thing as a weekend. People worked 6-7 days a week. At that time, he introduced the 5-day work week in his factories, and then slowly over the next 20 or so years, the law followed suit, and we got the Fair Labor Standards Act of the 1930s. Do you think that changes at private businesses can have a similar trickle-down effect now? I mean, we've been talking about how, some knowledge workers are starting to experiment with a 4-day work week. And do you think change is slower or more difficult now? Or, with the pace of technology, is change perhaps faster now?
Well, Henry Ford was was an influential businessman of his day. And you're right, he did play a kind of key role in normalizing this idea of a 40-hour work week. It took a big figure like that to kind of advance this notion into law. I agree with you that I think that business people can play a very important role, because what we're talking about is making the legal changes or instituting a change like moving from a 40-hour work week norm to a new norm of 32 hours is also cultural. It's social and cultural as well. It's the idea that people as a whole are kind of embracing it. And I kind of feel like there is a cultural force that's out there. Our business people, our business leaders have a strong cultural influence. They are influencers on the culture. So people like Jamie Dimon, who I wouldn't say is a radical left-wing guy, of Chase Bank, has said that we ought to be looking at a 32-hour work, a shorter work week. Steve Cohen apparently wants to buy more golf courses because, on part, I mean, it's a little bit maybe tongue in cheek, but on part, the idea that more people are going to have leisure. So I better get into the golf course business because that means more people are going to spend more time doing golf, right? These aren't like radical left-wing people. These are kind of the epitome of capitalism. They're saying we ought to look to a shorter work week. When the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida came to Washington to visit the White House and President Biden, I was fortunate as kind of a member of the Japanese diaspora to be invited to the state dinner and the state luncheon they had afterwards. But one of the folks that I was able to meet was the woman. I can't remember her name. This is really terrible, but she was head of Panasonic, Japan. Panasonic, the leader of Panasonic, I think in the 40s or 50s, was also instrumental, like Henry Ford, in getting a shorter work week done in Japan. Kind of Panasonic was a leader in that area. And they are actually doing domestic in Japan, some experiments with a shorter work week. The Japanese have done some of that as well, these experiments. There are a number of business leaders who are sort of moving into this area and who I think are part of moving this cultural conversation forward. It's happening in parallel with local governments. We have even in Missouri, of all places, kind of a small school district. Now, they were having trouble recruiting enough teachers and professionals to to teach in our school system down there. And they had limited budget. They couldn't raise the salaries enough. But then they decided, well, we'll start making the job be about that you're teaching 4 days a week. They got a huge uptick in applications. So we're looking at whether it's like local governments, business leaders at the large macro level, large national businesses, and labor unions. The 4-day work week is getting more and more serious consideration.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that it's, and when you're talking about private businesses getting behind it, my mind always goes to, and we talk about this a lot, it's a recruitment tool. Like if you're looking for a job, as you say, and one is offering a 32-hour work week and one is offering a 40-hour work week, it's a big recruitment tool to choose that other one. And as you say, yeah, I think it is a huge cultural shift, total rethinking of the way that we think about work. And yes, probably a trifecta of labor unions, business leaders, and governments. Congressman Takano, thank you so much for being here. A conversation that's really near and dear to my heart and really interesting. And thank you so much for your work on this topic.
Well, Kate, thank you. And I hope your listeners will agree that this is a really great topic. And thank you for the opportunity.
And that's all for this episode. If you're a new listener, be sure to subscribe to The New Way We Work wherever you listen. And if you like this episode, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We want to hear from you. Work is changing every day. What's the most pressing issue on your mind? Email us at podcast@fastcompany.com. The New Way We Work is produced by Julia Shu, Avery Miles, Blake Odom, and Joshua Christensen, with editing by Nicholas Torres.